Hello and welcome back to the latest Think Business podcast powered by Bank of Ireland. John Randles, CEO of Galway cybersecurity business Siren, talks about how the business began life as a PhD research project and has blossomed into a business that recently reported 162% revenue growth as well as its first patent. The Irish cybersecurity business has recently raised 12 million in backing from the European Central Bank to fight cybercrime. Randles talks about his career at the helm of indigenous Irish tech firms and why he believes the sector's best days lie ahead. So John, you're very welcome, and I will say that this isn't the first time we've talked. We've talked at least on a couple of occasions before. I remember once for the Irish Independent in 2007 and for Silicon Republic in 2013, and both were kind of, one was Polarlake at the early stages, and another stage was Polarlake, a company in Dublin, still alive in Dublin, that was at that point acquired by Bloomberg. And we're here today, obviously, to talk about a company called Siren that you're now the CEO of in Galway, which has recently raised funding and has got great potential in the cybersecurity space. But let's talk a bit about your own past, John. Like, we just before we talked to you, we actually go back even further to a company called Eontec, a banking software company in around the year 2000, and we're talking about how you guys had even set up a whole living room space to kind of demonstrate how banking would evolve, and everything was, I think we were looking at banking on your TV at that point.
That's right. Yeah, no, it's great to catch up with you again, John. And I go back quite a ways with technology startups in Dublin. So and as we're talking about, Eontec was really an innovator around banking technology, bringing it to multiple channels. Back then, this was a huge deal in the 90s. The internet was only starting out. People were not really au fait with the concept of how could you interact with your financial services products across many, many different channels. So one of the things Jim Callan did, our CEO, was build an apartment and build a series of different rooms to bring bankers through a journey of what the future of banking would look like. So you're sitting in your at home on your TV, the banking application comes up, you're going to your office, you're going to your mobile, all the things we take for granted now, we had to build and demonstrate in a physical environment because they weren't obvious then. And telling people how it would work, it just really brought the concept to life. There was just a brand new concept in the mid-90s.
It impressed me because I remember Jim, the CEO at the time, Jim Callan, take me through this. And at that point, the best I thought you could do with banking and technology was to get your balance on a WAP phone. Do you remember them? From the Matrix.
We had them. Yeah, absolutely. But it just showed you the power of bringing things to life for people, and visualizing them and getting people to come through the experience. I think it was very, very powerful.
And so when we talked then, you the next time I met you was probably when you were then in charge of Polarlake, which you then sold subsequently to Bloomberg. And, at the time I got this great sense that there was a need for clarity in the Wall Street world, after the whole financial crisis, and Bloomberg being a big financial information business, I think the headline at the time was "Data is the new oil," and data, ironically, the hyper-connected nature of it is, I suppose you could see that whole thing carried through to even the sudden movements with Silicon Valley Bank on that fateful week recently as well. Just everyone's so connected and informed, or talking to each other, that, the speed of information is frightening. Tell us about the Polarlake journey and then what led you then to Siren.
Yeah, so what the interesting thing about Polarlake was, before the financial crisis, we were getting, seriously involved in data management in the banking sector, right? And it was about cleaning up data, normalizing data, getting data in good conditions so you would have a better view of things like risk, and you'd have a better way of processing your trades. You'd have better quality data in the back office. And that was going along reasonably well until the financial crisis, when it actually really took off. Because I remember I was in Lehman Brothers the day it went bankrupt, right, in London, because we were trying to close the deal that day. And I'd been in Lehman's in New York the week before, and everybody said it's all good. Let's meet Monday morning. So literally, I was walking in the door. People were walking out. The famous scenes of people with boxes in their hands, and the BBC, ITV, Sky News chasing all these people. And I remember we had a very quickly called board meeting after that afternoon, and people said to me, we got to get customers in a different industry. Financial services is not the way to go. And I said, look, we absolutely need to hold our nerve here because, after the crisis, that's when banks really concentrated on data because they realized that those who had the best data traded their way much better through the crisis than those that had really poor data, right? So there was always known as the Lehman's event. Where were you in terms of your exposure, your risk, your ability to calculate your way through it would depend on how good the data infrastructure across the organization was. And there's some very well-known brands were excellent at calculating their risk on the fly. Other people were scrambling because their data was in poor shape, and it just shows you the power of data there and then, how to react to a crisis was down to data. And, one of the reasons why Bloomberg acquired Polarlake was they saw the huge macro trend in financial services was to get the data right at the back office, not just in the front office, because in the build up to the crisis, everything was about high speed trading. It was about sales and trading in the front office. It was about bonds, commodities, futures, options, everything that you could make money off, right? But then the emphasis in the next 10 years was about how do we clean up this data, trust this data, and the regulators really got heavy on how you actually report and what quality of the data infrastructure you have to build those reports instead of just believing the reports that people gave you. So that view of the data world coming right the way through the financial crisis. And we see it now. Your point about Silicon Valley Bank kind of brings me back in a way to those kind of events. And look, it's not the same, obviously, thankfully. But you learn through these kind of experiences.
And Siren is also another learning experience, I suppose, for all of us. Is I suppose last year, or the year before, when HSE got attacked, and the whole issue of cybersecurity suddenly came to bear on people, and we were kind of going, wow, how ready are organizations for things like ransomware attacks, you name it, and It just struck me just at how close, how easy it is. Not easy to do it, but certainly how easy a company can fall victim to even paying up and having to pay up and all this kind of stuff, simply because somewhere inside the organization there was a kind of a missing link or something. Or somebody just wasn't trained, or somebody basically fell victim to some kind of attack where they're made to believe something was real and wasn't. They clicked on a link or something. It just shows you how much money you put into a firewall. No matter what, all it takes is one person to make a mistake and it can undo the whole thing. But the interesting thing about Siren, you guys raised quite a bit of money there recently. It's a Galway company. You're increasing your head count. Tell us about the Siren story, because it's great that we have. I was saying to you before our call, I do believe we've never had so much diversity and promise in our startups than we have today, and certainly it's great to see a cybersecurity company in that mix, and certainly one from the west of Ireland. So tell us about the Siren story.
Yeah, so look, the Siren story and my own story intersect back in 2017. So I spent 5 years with Bloomberg after the acquisition. We built out the software we had into a data management utility. Really enjoyed that. It was like with massive investment, build it out into an operating model where we could take on the management of data on behalf of these huge organizations. So really enjoyed that. Then I realized that if I make Mike Bloomberg another $1 billion, it doesn't really matter, right? So there's more fun in the startup world. So I left and I ended up talking to a number of venture capital people to see what were interesting projects they were working on. And I had heard of Siren. I was familiar with it from a year before. Some people were talking to me about it. So it was actually Atlantic Bridge, who were an early investor in Polarlake, asked me to have a look at Siren. So I ended up investing myself. I ended up taking the CEO's role. And what I really liked about it was based on some great postdoctoral research, 10 years of research in the Derry Institute of University of Galway. It's now the Insight Centre. So what happened was there was PhD students and candidates from all across Europe gathered in Galway based on some really big EU initiatives at the time. And there was about 30 different PhDs working on this project at one stage, also working with MIT. And it was really looking about how do we rework the web? And Siren actually stands for Semantic Information Retrieval Engine. So coming from my background in saying 20 years in data management, 20 years looking at the problems of data, what the guys who were the original academics behind Siren had done was something really visually very, very appealing, very cool, very potentially transformative, but it still hadn't found the market, right? And so what we did in the early days, we're working with all sorts of industries, just seeing who really valued what we had, right? And what we were particularly good at was investigations, right? And but the investigations led us to things like cybersecurity, where you're doing threat investigations, threat hunting, things of that nature. But also we get involved in criminal investigations. We get involved in counter narcotics, counter terrorism, looking at things like human trafficking investigations, things like child exploitation prevention and investigation. So there's a whole range of things we get involved in, which is really, really exciting. So we took some great technology, worked with some really interesting people, and ended up on a fantastic mission as what we call keeping people, assets, and networks safe. So the cyber part is a big part of it, but also investigations bleed into the physical world. It bleeds into all different types of bad actors. So cyber for us is just another type of bad actor.
And it's the thing, because you guys have been involved in so many cases. I suppose I know I'm asking you to tell me about cases, but you work with like the FBI or the various crime agencies in America and around the world.
Yeah, we don't name any of the agencies we work with. We do have a global client base, and we're, most of our business currently is with law enforcement, and it can be a national security element, particularly looking at cybersecurity at an infrastructure level. You think of people that are trying to protect critical infrastructure. They're looking at their utilities, their oil and gas pipelines. They're looking at payments infrastructure, healthcare, things like that. So that's very interesting at that level. And then we can, go from a federal level right down to state and local level, where we deal with, local police that are looking to say, I've got 14 systems where I'm trying to find John Randles. How do I coalesce that together? How do I provide a unified search? And then how do I start an investigation from there? So it's a really, really interesting market.
And like the interesting thing that goes through my mind as well when I think of Siren, and I think of, as you say, its origins in the PhD research. I remember in 2000, Science Foundation in Ireland was formed, and the whole idea was to kind of create that tapestry that was kind of been missing, because most university research just scattered dust up until that point. It was done, it was gathered dust, people did their research with very few PhDs. The whole thing was just created and the whole tapestry laid out, and Ireland has become very good at going for things like horizon funding and whatnot. But when I think of Siren as one project, and I think of do you think there's multiple Sirens out there in the research ecosystem, and do you think your experience could create a template for building more companies out of that?
Yeah, and look, there's a lot of countries have done very well at building a template, and a lot of countries have constant debates about what's the right way to spin universities out, what's the right funding model, what are the difficulties, etc. But look, I think we're proud to provide a template for that. Like you think of Iona. Iona came out of university in a very similar type of manner as well. And
something like 80 companies came out of Iona, apparently, just over the time. That's amazing.
So it's a bit like, you can think of it this way, in terms of the overall infrastructure of companies coming out of universities, the more we do it, the more we get it right. it'll just lead to better examples, better learnings, and people will repeat the process again. But I think there's a huge amount of good work going on with people like Enterprise Ireland. You've got Atlantic Bridge University Fund, which were one of the early, they were the early investors in Siren as well. So so having funds matched to university projects and then matching with people like myself to help commercialize them and grow them into companies along the way. Like we're about 85 people now. So, and we've gone through multiple rounds of funding, and we think we're, scaling up significantly. So that should be a good news story for people coming out of university.
Well, that's from a university, right? That's from a bit of research that went on, a couple of PhDs leading to a veritable army of PhDs at one point. But when you think of that, that's 85 people. And they used to say when, a multinational came to Ireland, for every multinational job, that's one well-paying job in a multinational worth three in the local economy. It's worth figuring out, out of these companies that blossom from university research, what they result in local spend in the local economy in terms of further jobs being created from people just buying the groceries to God knows what. It all has a knock-on effect. But I suppose, what are your thoughts on the current startup ecosystem in Ireland? Now, you've been, like me, you've been around for the year 2000 dot-com bust. We've seen the financial collapse. Tech has kind of marched on and on and on. The last couple of months have given us a lot of people pause for thought. But I always like to remind people that even when the dot-com bubble had burst, companies like IBM, Microsoft were growing and expanding, and even companies like Apple at the time, year 2000, was only about to get started with things like its iPod, which led to the iPhone. So tech is in a constant state of continuum. It doesn't matter how many knocks it takes or how many jobs are lost. People are always innovating, and there will always be bigger companies and other companies making noise. And also, let's just face it, tech is ingrained in everything we do, so it's here to stay. The reality, though, is as we were talking there and we were reminiscing a bit about the past, I kind of really believe, and I said it, that we are at a point where I've never seen so much diversity in terms of types of companies. Certainly we could have more female leadership of Irish tech companies, but certainly not only in terms of diversity, but of people leading companies, but the actual kinds of companies as well. And there's a really good broad mash of companies out there now. And, whatever happens with funding and markets, it's probably been it's never been in a better state as far as I can see in terms of the promise and what can happen. What are your thoughts on the current ecosystem and what we can do to get past the current challenges that we're seeing at the moment?
Yeah, look, the way I think about it right now is if you look back to, say, what happened at the dot-com bust, and even the financial crisis, the next big crisis that came along my career. At that time, you had, a very different technology landscape. Most people were building, B2B systems for very niche markets, right? Even though they subsequently became big companies, the focus was quite a bit narrower than it is now. If you wind forward to now, you've got, what it takes to start and grow companies just much, much easier. You've got the cloud that wasn't there. You've got AI that wasn't there. Then you've got, even though people say, I wish there was more funding, there's infinitesimally more funding than there was back then, right? There was over $1 billion invested in through VC in Irish.
Yeah, there was virtually no venture capital in Ireland when Iona started in '98.
Exactly. No, there was, and I was quite small, So what you have now as well is, because we've been through a couple of cycles, overseas capital comes to Ireland now. I early in my career, we always went to everywhere else to fundraise. Now people want to meet me in Dublin because they're coming to Dublin, right? Uh-huh. That never happened before. So you've got growth equity, venture capital, private equity. They all have their Dublin visits now, right? And they'll go around the country, whereas in the past, that just didn't happen. One of the reasons why that happened is people have made money, right? It's an asset class that is now productive. It rewards, patient money, and people have had good outcomes. So people are coming here for good reasons. It's not out of charity. that anybody gets involved in technology, but people have had the return. So that is a very, very good sign that they're coming because they think it's a good market to invest in. So I'd be very, very positive on that score, just because as well, the companies that are there now compared to say 20 years ago are just much more robust. Back then there was the pattern of you start with maybe a local customer here, then you got one in the UK, then you maybe got one in Europe, and then you tried to go to the US. Whereas now, the phrase, immediately global, you look to, you don't care where your customers are. Customers will buy what you have if it's good enough, if it solves a problem anywhere in the world, right? And this has been something that maybe wasn't as true before COVID, but is definitely true now, and in terms of the attitude towards global partnerships and scaling and investing in sales and marketing is much different now than it was 20 years ago as well. Sales and marketing is now seen as a peer and something you need, whereas before it was like the technologists, basically look down their nose at the need to do sales and marketing. Now it's a first priority.
And the other thing as well is the west of Ireland as well. I mean, in Galway, in Sligo, in Limerick, down in Kerry, Cork, of course, but particularly the west. Galway has a certain ambition, and always had, and a lot of people don't. Like, when you think about when, I remember in the 90s when digital pulled out in the 90s, people thought, oh my God, it's the end of Galway as we know it. And, we had this huge amount of medtech companies suddenly blossomed from all these former digital employees. Now we've got a load of homegrown companies as well as multinationals in this perfect mix in this perfect little city that is, joy to be. I love Galway personally. But the actual energy that's there. Tell us a bit about what you see emerging from there. Companies like Siren and its ilk.
Yeah, so look, the one thing that I really like about being a Galway headquartered company is one, there's a great sense of community there, right? So the Porter Shed have done a great job of bringing people together, right? And then people learn from each other, people, cheer for each other, and it's got a great sense of vibrancy in that way. So people are unafraid to start things then because they see their peers doing interesting things, and it builds a certain infrastructure around that in terms of who's good at marketing, who's good at graphics, who's good at channel management, who's good at photography and video, and all this kind of things that you need when you're a growing business, but it's not always obvious there, particularly in smaller towns like that. And the other thing that Galway has going for it as well is there's more oxygen, as I put it, in terms of being in Galway. You're competing less with the multinationals, right? You've got, people always like, I've always thought it was a great thing when you're recruiting in a smaller company that somebody's working in headquarters, right? It makes a difference that you're closer to decision making, and while you can get great jobs in multinationals, you are a long way from decision making, right? By the, it is still a secondary office, no matter how big the office in Ireland. It's not core to where the key decisions of the future of business are being made. And that's very attractive when you're, bringing in, heads of marketing, heads of sales, heads of CFO, and basically building out an executive team that having that influence on the future of the business is a very, very important thing.
And finally, what's next for Siren? What's next on its scaling journey? You recently raised funding there, and obviously plans to increase your headcount and obviously your reach. But what's next in terms of, I suppose, direction of the company and your own ambition for it?
Yeah. So look, what we're effectively trying to do is build the Bloomberg terminal for investigators, right? So I spent 5 years at Bloomberg. I saw the power and the reach of having, as we say, data, news, and analytics, just in one box. It was X number of dollars per year, and there was 320,000 users. So the entire financial market's connected together through this thing called the Bloomberg terminal, right? So effectively what we're doing with Siren is, we now have the biggest set of data vendor partnerships in the world for investigators. That's the number one. Access to the data is the most important thing. We've got the a search-based analytics, which is our core software, which makes it a better experience to search and investigate that data. And the third thing, we've got people with real domain experience who are former crime investigators, former intelligence officers who can really help people to put that data together, right? So from our perspective, then, when you're starting an investigation, and this is where the world has changed dramatically for our clients. Now, the dark web is super important. Social media is important. Forums, news groups, the whole open source intelligence, massively important. And then how do you connect that to the whole crypto world? How do you connect that to crypto payments? What about offshore companies? What about ultimate beneficial ownership? Or what about digital forensics and files that you found at a crime scene? How do you link all of that together and tell a story that the data needs to tell for a prosecutor, for a defendant, for people that are looking at threats, people that are looking at corporate investigations? Bringing all that data together in a coherent way is really our vision for what we're going to do in the future, and we're just going to grow the business based on that.
And does the collaborative nature of crime investigation aid that, in the sense that it's data being pooled, and also it's a living organism of data?
Absolutely. So that's a key thing that an investigator will do. Is one, they'll do a search; two, they'll run analytics; and three, they want to share that outcome, right? So dissemination, as we call it. So that dissemination can be it can be across teams. It can be adding pieces of data as you go. It can be somebody's got another insight over here they need to add into it. It could be cross-country level. It could be cross-team level. It could be corporate with law enforcement. The difficulty in collaboration is immense, but that's where the opportunity is for those who can crack this and get it right.
Well, with that, John Randles, an absolute pleasure to talk to you once again. It's like it's coming up now in nearly 2 or 3 decades of talking to each other, so it's great. Listen, thanks again. I really appreciate it. I think Siren's a great company to watch, and I really wish you guys the best luck. So thanks very much.
All right, thanks very much, John. A pleasure as always.